Today, our focus is relationships, past and present, with the Moon in Libra. We review the role of Aries Sun conjunct the asteroid Lilith, the benevolence of Poseidon as the guide to our inner world of imagination, instincts, and intuition, and how the Plutonic pathway can help you identify, reframe, and rehabilitate trapped emotions and childhood trauma. Hey there, Truth Seeker. Welcome to the Star Kittens community where we discuss 13-sign astrology. Are you in alignment with your divine design? Do you want to master the metaphysical reality? Open the doors of perception. Each planetary body is an archetype, a template, if you will, that helps us interpret human behavior and the world around us. The more awake and aware we are, the more synchronicity will show up in your life. Today, we are exploring the heavy-hitting Libra full moon, where the Sun conjunct Lilith and Moon conjunct Poseidon ignite a high-intensity T-square with Pluto and Juno. To help us reach more souls with this important message, please like, share, and subscribe. There's a lot going on, so let's jump in. Kia ora, David.
Kia ora.
We have stepped into the Aries energy, finally.
Yes.
The start of a new solar year, and today we are going to discuss the full moon happening on the 2nd of May. Here in New Zealand it is at 5:23 a.m, which is Saturday morning. And the theme of today is relationship. So today we are going to start on the Libra side of the chart, and the moon is sitting there making a close conjunction with Poseidon.
Yeah. And we get to talk about Poseidon as an archetype. It's one of those ones that is always there, obviously, but we haven't referred to it very often. But in this particular reading, it's very strongly focused or aspected because of the conjunction with the moon, but also a square that it is forming with Pluto and Juno, and the opposition, of course, to the Sun and Lilith on the other side. So Poseidon has a big role to play, especially when it's conjunct the moon. But in the context of Libra, we're talking about relationships. And just to be clear, our definition of these relationships is those relationships that are serious and committed. And generally the way to determine if a relationship is serious or committed is that there is some form of either implied or explicit contractual agreement or arrangement between the two parties. And the reason, so it needn't be necessarily a full legal agreement, but there's certainly an implied agreement that you will behave and act, both parties will behave and act in a certain way, and that there are consequences if you don't do so. And the reason that we'll just take a moment to baseline what a Libra relationship is within the context of the astrological mosaic, it's so important to differentiate that from other types of relationships which include flights of fancy, which will be a Leo, like a lover, for example, as opposed to a long-term partner. That's a different type of relationship. You also have sibling and family relationships, which tend to fall in that sort of 3rd and 4th house of sibling rivalries and family. And then you have relationships also within the workplace, so colleagues, so that tends to fall in that 6th house as well of work and well-being. So specifically, just before I provide any interpretation, I'm being clear that the relationships we're talking about here are contractual, either implied or explicit relationships. They're serious in nature. They needn't necessarily be romantic, but they do have a serious element to them. They needn't necessarily be male and female. They may be male-male or female-female, or they may be within the context of work or business as well. And for as I was focusing on this, it came to me quite strongly through my own intuition to make the point that the relationships we're talking about here are both past relationships, present relationships, or in the case of preparation for a future relationship. So I wanted to just draw out the past, the present, and the future relationships, because people that are not in a committed, serious relationship may think immediately, oh, this doesn't apply to me, and so therefore I'm not going to draw anything from this interpretation. But everyone has either been in a relationship, a serious, committed relationship, personal or business, in the past, they're currently in one now, or they're going to be in one in the future. So that's just a little bit of a background, and a level set was important before we talk about this. So the Poseidon energy here is representative of the subconscious mind. Now Poseidon, as we've talked about in previous readings, we've referenced that there are often two names for similar deities, depending on the Greco-Roman, or in fact sometimes in the Eastern mythologies as well. They have their own interpretations. But Poseidon is an octave of Neptune energy. So when we're talking Poseidon, we are referring to a deity, an energy, an archetype that is very similar to, but it's a slightly different flavour from Neptune. So Neptune and Poseidon, again, they're in that Piscean energy, and we spoke a lot in the previous podcast, and I think maybe the previous two. We spent a lot of time talking about Pisces, so I'm not going to go over that. But Poseidon is definitely related to this Neptune energy. So we are talking about the subconscious mind, and when Poseidon is paired up with the moon, we are talking about the inner planes. So again, in the context of a relationship, we are dealing with the emotional and the psychic and the spiritual aspects of these committed relationships, as opposed to the physical and the intellectual aspects. So it's the inner world, the kind of the fluffy stuff, if you like, of relationships that altogether I believe are more important ultimately in the success of relationships. Is if they're simply focused on the intellectual or the physical world, you miss out a number of these other dimensions. So what the moon conjunct Poseidon and Libra is saying is that there are other aspects of these relationships, and that's what we'll talk about today. So the subconscious mind and the inner planes, and therefore we are talking about the unresolved issues that manifest as dysfunction in our relationships, that are coming from unresolved issues, usually in childhood, usually traumas, usually emotional experiences that we haven't integrated into our lives because we were unable or unwilling to do so. But equally, because the moon is involved, and we refer to the moon as the repository of soul, these may be traumas or energies that are bleeding into our subconscious reality that are coming from other experiences that we've had. They may also be genetic inheritances too. So there's a number of layers to the subconsciousness, not just in the linear timeline of our current age of when we were born, so we can go back and say, oh, I had a terrible experience when I was 9 and it's affecting me now when I'm 55. Yes, but it may also be a trauma that is coming through either the soul's experience of having had previous, past or parallel lives, if you believe in that idea, or it's drawing from the collective unconsciousness as well. So it is bleeding into our reality, which is then manifesting in a relationship. So we've got these unresolved issues, or these traumas that are manifesting as dysfunction within relationship, that are coming from the subconscious mind on either one or both partners. So Poseidon offers to us intuition and spiritual insight. Poseidon's role, therefore, is to provide for us, as it's to act like a guide, to take our hand and help us to delve into the inner world of our fears and our phobias, to go into the darkness of the unresolved traumas, the trapped emotions that rest and reside in unawareness, that manifest as knee-jerk reactions to triggers within relationships. And we all have those experiences. We all have something that really irks us about our partner, or something that happens within our relationship, past, present, or those that we're preparing for in the future, where it just grinds our gears. And often those reactions are an indication or a signal coming from the subconscious mind, i.e. that of Poseidon and that of the moon, that we need to go inward in order to resolve those things. And we touched before when we were preparing for this talk that as opposed to what a lot of people do is, let's go and get some counseling. Let's talk this out. Let's figure it out mentally rather than emotionally or spiritually or psychically. Just to be clear once again, to reinforce that. So Poseidon plays this guidance role that helps us to unearth, to uncover self-limiting emotions, debilitating energy within our subconscious reality, i.e. within our psyche, that's preventing us from achieving our potential, our highest self. Right? Now, often these, as I touched on before, these debilitating energies, these fears, these phobias, these areas where we have resistance emotionally, right? Often they can be tied to a childhood trauma, some experiences we've had in the media. They can be tied to our lineage, our roots, but they can also be coming from, as I said, the repository of soul. So these might be issues that we've been dealing with cyclically over and over and over again. So what this moon is saying, especially with Aries on the other side, is that if you are in that situation, that there's an opportunity here to take some very forceful action with Aries. So guided imagery and dream work. So how do you do this? So if we are to activate the archetype of Poseidon to help us within the context of these relationships to deal with and surface, if you like, unresolved issues that are manifesting as dysfunction that are displeasing to either partner, one of the ways we can do this as a classic thing to do is guided imagery. And that guided imagery is where we use, say, tarot cards, dream cards, any type of card that's got an image that allows us to visually see something, and these imagery, these cards speak directly to our subconscious. This is why tarot is so powerful, but there's other cards. I noticed you've got a number of sets of these cards, and I was pulling some the other day. So these guided imagery cards are very powerful when we're working with Poseidon and Moon energy, because they anchor us, they trigger us on a multi-dimensional perspective. They get through and bypass our mental filters when we're looking at an image, let's say of the Moon card in the Rider-Waite deck, or of the Hanged Man, which represents Poseidon in the Rider-Waite deck, or of the Devil card, which represents the energies of Capricorn and Saturn, which we'll touch on later. When you stare at those, when you just look at those in a mindful way, or any card, you're bypassing the filters of the mind. You're getting through the intellectual barriers, the ego barriers that allow or don't allow us to go into the inner planes of Poseidon and the Moon. So guided imagery using cards is a very effective way to tap into and to activate the energies of Poseidon and the Moon at this full moon in the context of relationships. Hypnosis is another. Tapping is another. Emotional freedom techniques is another. Using or getting immersed in light and sound are other techniques. Meditation and mindfulness, where you focus on the inner eye, where you draw on your imagination. Any technique that allows you to bypass the intellect will allow those who are listening, who really recognize that within the context of a relationship, either the past or present or relationship in the future, i.e. if fear is holding you back with going into a relationship, which may be drawn from the inner worlds of Poseidon and the Moon, here is a practical technique, Aries, to go inward in a guided way to address some of these things. And any technique that can allow us to draw on our imagination, our intuition and our instincts is going to be effective here. And just to wrap this piece up, instincts as opposed to intuition, and I've touched on this before, but they are different. Intuition comes from the higher faculties of the third eye and the sixth chakra and the higher mind. Instincts come from the lower chakras and the red and the red and the orange chakras, so they sit in the gut, so they sit in the sacral region. Instincts are our reaction to external stimuli. And if you want to understand instincts, watch animals. Watch them closely and how they instinctively react to something. as opposed to the human ability, which is to intuitively react. So you have to draw on both. And then we have a third aspect of this guided imagery, which is our imagination, which is actually a blend of what we call whole brain thinking, which is you can see an image and then you can imagine through projection, this is using the faculties of the mind, what that might look like. So we have imagination of the mind, intuition of the higher mind, and instincts of the gut, which of course is the second brain or the lower mind. So those are the three pieces that are very important, and that's a kind of a summary of Poseidon-Moon in the context of Libra relationships. There's a lot I've covered there, but I just had to make sure that I hit all the notes.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is such a rich life if you are currently in a relationship and there are these things that you can do together. So whether it is meditating together in the same space, you could, discuss of let's focus on manifesting a certain outcome, and you do that together. And I think those combined energies tapping into it's almost a combination of the imagination and the intuitive side of us. Or you go together to a sound bath, or you do tapping, or it's just beautiful to be able to do those together. But if there are fears, as you spoke about, of stepping into that committed relationship that you might be yearning for, and there's just something inside you that is unwilling or scared to take that next step, then again, these techniques are a beautiful way of opening that doorway to there. So thank you for listing those different things out. So just for people imagining the chart, we have the moon and Poseidon sitting on one side. So the moon is sitting at 3 degrees Libra. And opposite, during this full moon, we have the sun sitting at 12 degrees Aries, right next to Lilith at 11 degrees Aries. So we spoke a lot about Lilith last time, but I look forward to how you are incorporating this whole relationship vibe this time.
Yep, and of course we have at the top of that this massive T-square, which we'll come to later, but that's got the big planet of Pluto and of course Juno there. But let's talk about Aries Sun on the other side, as this opposition, if you've just pointed out, and then Lilith, and its conjunction of Aries Sun to Lilith. I'll separate the two and then I'll blend them. The first is the Aries Sun. So we're talking about a solar cycle. So this is going back, where is it? How many degrees is the sun? The sun's at 12 degrees. So 12 days ago, 18th, 19th of April, the sun first moved into Aries. So we have this solar cycle that's just kicked off. So that's the first thing. So we've touched on that in the past, but understanding a solar cycle as opposed to, let's say, the lunar new year, which is in February, but this is very much a beginning of something, and it always happens in April. And interestingly, we touched on this last time, these Aries solar cycles coincide more often than not in the West with the Easter period of birth, death, and resurrection. So we have this new cycle which has just begun, and we're a few days into it, of Aries, and that's all about initiation and kick-starting. But let's draw it back to the context of what's on the other side of the moon conjunct Poseidon in Libra, is kick-starting an emotional clearing process within these relationships. And as I said before, not necessarily a present relationship, it may be great, but a past relationship that you can learn from, or preparing itself for a future relationship. So there is very much a focus of emotional, psychic and spiritual clearing here when we're dealing with the Aries Sun. And Aries is a forceful sign. Its colour is red, its spirit animal is the ram, its number is 1, and we talked about its planetary guardian is Mars, a warrior planet. So we are talking about attacking these emotional, psychic, spiritual blockages that may be residing or lurking in our subconscious reality and manifesting in conflict and dysfunction within our Libra relationships. These things are lurking. Sometimes it needs the warrior, the inner warrior, and that fiery nature to be willing to actually go into the inner worlds, because this isn't easy stuff at all. So we need that Aries fire. We need to gird our loins, as it were. We need the courage and boldness and bravery to step into the unknown, because the subconscious is the unknown. If we are going to go through genuinely a process of clearing emotional baggage, childhood traumas, unresolved issues, that may in fact, as I said before, be coming from the soul, the repository of soul, so they've been there for a long time, they might have been lifetime after lifetime, and playing out in drama after drama after drama, you need that Aries energy. So you wear this thing, put it on like as a suit of armor, and move forward confidently. Because sometimes, even within the best relationships, we need to be confrontational. Not overly aggressive or dominant, but confrontational, and have a willingness to actually look at emotional trauma, to look at unresolved issues, to look at projection, which we're going to touch on next. But the Aries energy is physical, and it is a counterbalance to the emotional energy on the other side. Of course, we have fire of Aries, and on the other side we've got this double water energy of the Poseidon, Pisces energy, and the Moon, also Cancer energy, sitting in an air sign of Libra. So we've got quite a volatile set of energies here. You've got air of Libra, you've got the water of Poseidon and Cancer, the Moon rather, and you've also got on the other side the Sun sitting in Aries in a fire sign. If you were experimenting and putting fire, water and air into a beaker or a situation, you'd need to be pretty careful about what you're doing, because anything can happen, right? So the relentlessness, the driven, assertive nature of Aries helps us within the context of relationships past to diagnose, to deconstruct, to go back, to review, to think about, where did I go wrong, or where did we go wrong? That's as valuable as looking at a present relationship as it is thinking about present or past relationship, and in preparation for a future relationship as well. So we need to have that Aries energy. But when Aries is combined with Lilith, and Aries Sun is sitting pretty much on top of Lilith, so Lilith's at 11 degrees 46, Aries Sun's at 12 degrees 18. They're basically right on top of each other. The first thing that comes to me with the Lilith energy is, pardon the French, a peed off female. A really angry feminine energy, being stirred up by Aries fire. And where would some of this anger, and I'm not talking about a female, I'm talking about feminine energy that has been stirred up by masculine fire. So what that can surface, well, we don't know what it can surface, but it could be quite messy, to say the least, in the context of relationship. But Lilith, as we've talked about before, is a feminine template. And I explained in our last podcast about the two versions of the Lilith or the Eve archetype. One is a freedom seeker who has agency and is willing to stand in her sovereignty and her truth and to follow that. And the other is an obsequious, subjected female archetype who's been suppressed and is, say, in the context of a relationship, is in, say, an arranged marriage or an unhappy relationship, and is unwilling to find the Aries energy to get out of it or to confront what's going wrong. So we have the Lilith schism, if you like, or split between these two archetypes I touched on in depth, of the one who says, this relationship isn't working, I'm going to find my fire and my feet, my sovereignty, my independence. I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore. This isn't working for us. And remember that Lilith energy is a template. So this can be manifesting in both a male and a female, because what we're tapping into is those two areas within relationships that one is subjugated, suppressed, and repressed. And that could be the male being repressed by the female. So this is an energy we're talking about of Lilith, and is willing to suffer in silence and not step up and do something about that. And then we have the other energy of somebody, and it could be the male or the female, but the Lilith archetype of independence and sovereignty and willingness to confront, which is the Aries Sun. So when we have this, I like to always talk about the negative but also the positive. But we have a real agitation of this feminine template or archetype. Now, a template or archetype within a relationship is an image, if you like. It's an idea of how femininity operates within the psyche. So it's the internal reference point and how it expresses externally in terms of roles and responsibilities and characteristics and attributes, the characters that we play. This feminine energy exists as a template, as an image, as an archetype within both masculine and feminine characters, within males and females. We all have a Lilith archetype. To make this a little easier to understand, though, I'm going to talk about the idea in the Jungian archetypes, which is part of this guided imagery I'm talking about. So we are using techniques and frameworks that allow us to go inwards into the inner worlds of the psychic, the spiritual and the emotional within the context of relationships. And we've talked about how the cards and guided imagery is one way we can do that. Another way we can do that is using archetypes, which are anchoring points. And within the context of Lilith here and these relationships that we're talking about, we can look at the Jungian archetypes of anima and animus. So the anima is the inner feminine side of a man. That's the template he holds of empathy, emotion. And the animus is the inner masculine side of a woman. It's the template she holds of logic and action. Integrating those aspects within the individual is essential for wholeness within that individual and individuation, so evolution of that person's character, the growth of that person's character. And we're going to touch on in a moment how anima and animus operates within the context of relationships. So if I am the male and I am not owning my empathy and my emotion, and my partner is expressing empathy and emotion to me, I have a choice, and this is the Lilith archetype. I have a choice to thank my partner for mirroring to me my inner feminine and work systematically to develop my emotion and my empathy in myself. That's how I grow within the context of a relationship. I can do that. That's sovereignty and growth. That's one of the Lilith paths. Or I can just defer to that energy in my partner of empathy and emotion in this case. Let's add intuition. Let's add creativity. Let's add imagination. Let's add nurturing. All of those feminine qualities. I can say, oh no, she's got that. I don't need to develop that. So therefore I'm lacking the willingness to actually develop it in myself. I'm saying, no, she's taking care of that. And in fact, that causes imbalance in the relationship, because if the female partner who's exhibiting those qualities that the male is recognizing but unwilling to integrate into himself, when he is faced with emotional vulnerability with a 16-year-old daughter or a son who might be hurt and crying when he thinks that's not appropriate, he doesn't have the ability on his own, with his own agency, to tap into those feminine qualities. He doesn't have the ability because he hasn't developed them. And so therefore he will defer to and say, no, go see your mother. And if the mother's not around, there's a serious problem within that relationship. So this is why it's so important to understand the anima and the animos and how it works in these relationships and how it ties back to the Lilith archetype and those two paths that I talked about. So let's go the other side, the animos, the inner masculine side of a woman, the logic, the action, all of those Aries qualities of aggression, of drive, of relentlessness, of courage, of boldness, of assertiveness, of even sometimes force, right? So the female sees that in their partner, it's exhibited to them, and that is the animos, so that is a partner is reflecting back to them inequalities that they hold as a template, but they don't want to develop those things for a whole series of reasons, and therefore when they need to be courageous and confrontational and aggressive and driven in whatever context it is, then they will immediately defer to and say, no, my husband always handles that, or my partner always handles that, and they don't have the confidence because they haven't developed it in themselves. So you see very clearly how the anima and the animos are actually reversals and how relationships are mirrors. And these mirrors are very important if we're going to touch on Juno as being the pinnacle of relationships. If we are to develop these relationships to the fullest extent possible, and we need to go inwards, we look at the external triggers and we look at where we are triggered. And I used those examples before. The man sees these feminine qualities in his partner, but when he has to draw on them himself because he hasn't developed them, and his daughter has a problem and needs his vulnerability and his nurturing and his kind of masculine nurturing view as opposed to mum's view, or he needs his imagination to be activated and he hasn't developed that, he's missed a trick within the relationship, and this is what leads to dysfunction. And equally on the other side, the females many times let's take an example of contracts and commitments, which I talked about as being a feature of these Libra relationships. They don't feel like, I don't have the courage to put in there, let's say it's an employment, a boss, or a partnership, say a commercial relationship. They don't allow, or it's say a prenuptial agreement or a marriage agreement or a property agreement or something like that. They don't fit that. They think like, no, I could do better there, or I could assert myself there, which is this Aries energy, but I'm not willing to do it, or I need to have my partner come in and do that, or be the cudgel, or be the force. So there are so many angles to this, but I think I've made the point that the Aries energy is a counterbalance to the emotional needs, but in the context of Lilith, we are talking very much about anima and animos. And just to be clear that this was developed by Carl Jung, these are archetypes, and they have emerged from the collective unconsciousness, and they, i.e. Pisces and the moon, that influence how individuals relate to the opposite gender. So, very important, and I thought that if we own our anima and animus within relationships, we are not only giving ourselves agency to develop as individuals, but it also powers up the relationship too. And you talked before about, doing things together. For you and I, for example, I love using tarot cards and, all these kind of spiritual things, and listening to your sound baths, for example, because I have integrated that into my reality. Not so much that I have to sit there and rely on you to provide it for me. I can go and do it myself, so that I now have agency. And to wrap that up, if I tie that back to those two expressions of Lilith, one is I will defer to and be subject to my partner's experience, say in imagination, intuition, sound baths, spiritual healing, guided imagery, light working, all of that, I will defer to her, or I can bring my own version of that. And then there's the other, which is the one that says, awesome, thank you for showing that to me. Thank you for reflecting to me where I can be better. Thank you for showing me where I can develop agency and autonomy and sovereignty, and I can focus on becoming more balanced, which ultimately is what Libra is about, as an individual, so that I'm functioning in what I said before, that whole brain, that ability to move from the left brain, the right brain, the left brain, the right brain, and back again, and to be very comfortable operating in those kind of spiritual realms, psychic realms, physical realms, and intellectual realms as well.
Yes, using each other to become a more full-bodied, whole-brained, sovereign being. Yeah. So let's go to the top of this T-square where we have both Pluto and Juno sitting in Capricorn. Pluto is sitting at 5 degrees and Juno at 7. So we have this beautiful triangle with the Sun and Lilith sitting on the bottom on one side. Then on the other side of this triangle, we have the Moon with Poseidon sitting in Libra. And as you then draw two lines going up, where they join, they meet, that's where we have Pluto and Juno sitting in Capricorn. Capricorn is an earth sign. We spoke about Aries being fire and Libra being air. So we have this beautiful triple energy happening at this full moon. And of course, Juno is also all about relationships. So how do these two energies, Pluto and Juno, coming together to then make this whole triangle work?
It's a good question, and it's a very interesting one to ponder on, where we have two very powerful archetypes sitting at, and just to be clear, we've talked about this before, that when you have a T-square and you have energies, you think of a triangle, and you have energies on one corner and energies on the other corner, and then of course the apex or the peak of the triangle is where those energies that are at the bottom corners, in this case Lilith and the Sun on one side and Poseidon and the Moon on the other side, where they're interacting through the opposition, but then they're both the kind of individual and blended aspects of that filter through the top of the triangle, which in this case is Pluto and Juno. So that's a very intense point. Just think about a volcano. This is where these things explode and erupt and come into reality. So the first thing I'm going to touch on with Pluto and Juno is the sign that they're in, which is the sign of Capricorn. And Capricorn, of course, most people will know that Capricorn, the guardian of Capricorn is Saturn. And we've talked about guided imagery using, say, tarot cards as one example. So I'm going to have a practical example of using a tarot card, guided imagery. I'm using the Rider-Waite deck, and I'm going to look at the card, for example, to help us interpret this for the energies of Saturn and Capricorn. Just to give us a little bit of a starting place here in the context of relationships. So I asked a generator, what is the significance of the black box in the Devil card in the Rider-Waite deck? And it's come back and said in the Rider-Waite tarot deck, the black box or pedestal upon which the Devil Baphomet perches is a significant symbol of materialism, narrow-mindedness, and the incomplete foundation of self-delusion. Well, isn't that interesting? So we've got materialism, narrow-mindedness, and self-delusion, all of which are aspects of which can come up in a relationship, especially self-delusion when we don't deal particularly well with Poseidon and the Moon. So that black box, and there's lots to this card, but I just wanted to focus on the black box. The black box serves as a base for the Devil's power representing a confined reality that the figures chained to it have accepted, despite the chains being loose enough to escape. So if we are to take a liberty here and say the two figures in the Devil card, the Rider-Waite, in the context of this reading, represent a male and a female in a relationship that are chained to the idea of the narrow-minded idea of materialism. And I touched before about the multiple layers of relationships. There's the material, there's the physical, there's the spiritual, there's the psychic, there's the emotional. So these two individuals in this card, and again this is a square to Pluto and Juno in the sign of Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn, which is represented by the Devil card. So I'm using guided imagery to help us understand this. So this is a couple that's focused only or pretty much on the material world. And they're dismissing and ignoring all other aspects, which is what this lunation is asking us to do, is to have the courage, Aries, to go inward and look at spiritual, emotional and psychic energies that exist within the relationship. So what might be getting in the way of that is this T-square, this Pluto energy particularly. So the black box also includes materialism and limited perspective. The black box represents a narrow materialistic view of life, that which can only be seen, touched or bought, money and power, and that is all that is believed to exist. So there's no spiritual, there's no Poseidon, there's no repository of soul, there's no emotional content that's of any relevance in this view, this limited view. And this is this Pluto energy in Capricorn. The unreflected self, it symbolizes this black box to which these two individuals, and we'll say in a relationship, are chained. They're not really chained, but let's just go with this interpretation. The black box represents this, or symbolizes the unreflected self, or the unknown within the non-mysterious world, that represents the hidden, unconscious or unexamined shadow aspects. Exactly what Poseidon is asking us to do is to examine the hidden, unconscious shadow aspects of ourselves as individuals and also within the relationships. Past or present relationships, or in preparation for a future relationship. So again, another piece of this, the black box, often interpreted as half a cube, represents an incomplete understanding of spiritual truth, or an unbalanced top-heavy view of life. So in other words, there's just material world and that's it. It's a solid base for falsehood. The human figures are chained to this pedestal that indicates that they are enslaved and fixated by the physical material world. Why are we talking about the physical material world? Because in the T-square is Capricorn, which represents the physical material world. Why are we talking about the Devil card? Because the guardian or overseer of Capricorn is Saturn, who's often represented by the Devil. And finally, the dark foundation, the dark box. And I encourage all those that are listening, if you don't have a Rider-Waite deck, I'm looking at a physical card and it's in my hand. But of course you can go to the internet and just look at it. A dark foundation, this represents a vat of dark watery substance, or a foundation of fear. Interesting. Where the figures choose instead of inner regeneration and enlightenment, which is also Poseidon, they choose the comfort of a cage of the known over the unknown. And therefore they close themselves off to the possibilities of freedom. Very interesting. A dark foundation, which is described as a watery substance or foundation of fear. And I touched before about the fears and phobias that we must confront when we go inwards, when we're dealing with Poseidon and Moon energy. So that black box represents or mirrors the throne of the High Priestess, interestingly as well. But where she sits upon a balanced cube indicating knowledge of the higher mysteries, the Devil sits upon a block that signifies the triumph of matter over spirit. So if you want to look at the positive aspect of that, if you're going inward, you would draw on the High Priestess card, which again taps into what I was talking about before, about that other side of Lilith, is that the High Priestess card, when dealing with materialism, would help you to tap into higher knowledge and a balanced view of materialism. Balance, of course, relating to Libra. So I'm going to ask another question just to wrap this up. What is the significance of the two pillars in the Rider-Waite Moon deck? And here we go. So in the Rider-Waite Moon card, the towers or the pillars, and we're talking about the moon, of course, represent the threshold of the unknown and the boundary of the physical world. So once again, we have materialism and the physical world coming up, which of course is represented at the top of this T-square by Capricorn. So when we look at the moon card in the Rider-Waite deck, we see a dog and a wolf howling at the moon. We see a crayfish emerging from the waters of the subconscious, and a pathway leading between two pillars, and the sun in the background representing enlightenment and awakening. The dog represents the tamed intellect, because we touched on before that when we go into the inner world, if we're not anchored to something like guided imagery, like hypnotherapy, like sound bowls, or like this all has frameworks, like tarot cards, we can be swept away by what we find. So we must anchor. So in the moon card, we see these two pillars that represent the threshold to the unknown, the boundary of the physical world. Unlike the clearly defined pillars in other cards, these are man-made structures that frame the path towards a distant, uncertain landscape. So the significance in the moon card of these pillars is that they are a gateway to the unknown. We started this reading with the idea that Poseidon is a guide sitting at the threshold of the subconscious within the context of relationships. And we talked about in the second part of the distortions that emerge into relationships that come from an inability to integrate as a male the feminine aspects of their divine design, and for the female the inability to integrate the masculine aspects of their divine design. So we need to go inwards, and the answers to these things, or these struggles, these fears, these phobias, is not in the intellect, it's in the subconscious. So these pillars in the moon card, which is very instructive for us. The space between these towers is known as the issue into the unknown. They mark the exit from the familiar, rational world of the left brain intellect into the wild, unmapped territory of the subconscious. These two pillars, however, represent the boundary of consciousness. The towers represent the limits of the human intellect and the gates of heaven. Beyond them lie distant mountains which symbolize higher spiritual attainment. They can only be reached by navigating the dimly lit path of intuition. Such power in these cards, so much imagery that we're combining guided imagery of the image of looking at these cards in the context of this reading, because Poseidon is a guide into the inner world. So I'm giving a practical example of how I would do this, how we as a partner, as twin flames, would do this. Duality and guarding the pillars. They are often used as watchtowers representing dualities such as good and evil, east, west, known, unknown, love, hate, good, bad, cold, hot. Because they look identical, they emphasize the difficulty of distinguishing truth from illusion in the moonlight. Well, that's a classic example and a manifestation of Poseidon and moon energy together. See, Poseidon, the shadow side of Poseidon, or Neptune, as we talked about before, represents delusion, mass hypnosis. So these pillars of bounded rationality or bounded consciousness, which are absolutely vital when we go into the inner world. We must have some kind of limits to how far we go, lest we be swept away in darkness and destruction. Interestingly, Masonic temple links, esoterically these pillars are sometimes linked to the pillars of Jachin and Boaz from Solomon's temple, though in the moon card they are depicted as solid fortresses rather than the decorative pillars seen again as we see in the High Priestess. And finally, the other core symbols of the moon. The path is a winding road that represents a journey toward enlightenment. What is enlightenment? It's awareness. It is described as a hardly lit path where you must rely on intuition rather than sight. And the crayfish emerging from the water, this crustacean, represents our most primitive instincts. And I talked before about intuition and instincts, and here we go again. This represents our most primitive instincts that come up out of the depths, the early, sometimes hideous stages of spiritual or psychological development. So, tying this up and wrapping this up in a little bit of a summary as to where Juno rests in all of this, we know that Juno refers to relationships. I think that's self-evident here that Juno is reaffirming the Libra relationship idea that we started with. But Pluto represents something else, where Pluto represents what we call the Plutonic pathway. And this is the final anchor that we will provide for how, if you are going inwards and you are dealing with dysfunction, if you are dealing with unresolved issues, childhood traumas, or soul memories bleeding into your relationships that are manifesting as dysfunction, a pathway that you can use is what we call a Plutonic pathway, which again is this T-square. It's at the peak of this opposition between Lilith and Aries, Sun on one side, Moon and Poseidon on the other, in Libra, Pluto, of course, in Capricorn. So the Plutonic pathway, this is our technology, if you like, or our interpretation. We think that the Plutonic pathway breaks into three pieces. The first is transmute negative energy through awareness. We've just talked about that with the moon card. The crayfish emerging from the subconscious. The willingness to stand Aries at the gate of your subconscious and go inward so that you can experience enlightenment. So you have to transmute negative energy, and negative energy might be resistance to doing that in the first place. You transform situations and scenarios by reframing. So let's give an example of this within a relationship. We talked about this before. So two people, and I'll give a silly example. The male always wants to drive the car, and the female also wants to drive the car. But every time they go to drive the car, there's an unseemly fight to get the keys. But the male, who's bigger and physically more imposing than the female, always gets the keys. He always drives the car, even though he knows his partner wants to drive the car. So that's a negative situation. But if we look at that situation and scenario in reframing and through this Plutonic pathway, we have to go back into childhood. And what we find is that the male is actually just replicating what he was told by his father when he was 9 and 10 and 11 and 12, and reinforced over and over and over and over, and that females can't drive. You, son, have to be the driver. You need to be in the driver's seat, he said. And he took this as gospel and enshrined it as a belief and held on to it until he was 45. And he had constant fights with his partner over this. And it was something that got seeded in him at age 9. He's now 45. And finally, he's hearing our reading of Star Kittens Media, and they're talking about, oh, maybe I need to think about that. But not think about it, emotionally engaged with that whole scenario. So silly, but practical example of the Plutonic pathway. So the awareness comes from the relationship. She finally gets her Lilith and stands up to him. Finally gets her Lilith. She draws on that physical intimidation energy and takes it inward, the animus, and says, I'm going to use some of that, not necessarily physical intimidation, but I'm going to find the energy of Aries, the courage to stand up and say, enough of this. And they confront this issue together. And he goes back and he says, actually, dear, I'm sorry. I've been like this because I didn't realize it, because it was buried in the mists of time, Poseidon and the moon, but Dad told me this. So here we get to awareness, the first part of the Plutonic pathway. Negative energy, which is the externalization of that situation, is causing conflict. That's the first part of this Pluto energy. Awareness. Then a discussion takes place, not just an intellectual, it's an emotional traverse into the past, and he finds, I'm no longer 9. I'm no longer 15. I'm 45. And yet I'm still acting like a 9-year-old. And so he reframes the situation and says, I no longer have to act like that way. That's okay, dear. You drive. You're a really good driver. And he reframes it. And this is where we get to the third part of the Plutonic pathway, which is you transcend the beliefs and see it's kind of back to front, but it's actually beautiful the way this works. It's because what was underneath that negative energy was actually a belief. And where did that belief come from? We've talked about this before. It was seeded in him by his parent, but he didn't understand that actually he was projecting that all the way forward at 45, and it was causing this conflict in this relationship. So he had to create awareness, transmute the negative energy through awareness, transform the situation or scenario through reframing, and finally you can transcend the belief. That's the last part of the process of a practical example of saying, how does a Lilith Sun and a Poseidon-Moon interact with a Juno Pluto in a T-square? And that's where we'll leave it.
I have so enjoyed the practical steps you've shared with us all today, from sharing the different techniques of taking the actions of integrating your feminine and masculine energies, the sound bowls, the tapping, the meditation, to really looking at imagery and helping us understand that within us. I'm looking at the cards now as well, and they're stunning. If you've never truly looked at the Rider-Waite deck, even each colour that is used in the images has a meaning. You know, there is light blue on the moon card, whereas in other images they've used a dark blue, and then the different colours of blue have a different meaning. So I highly recommend taking some time to really study those. And then of course the Plutonic pathways. It's such a easy 3-step method of overcoming a lot of different things. If you're totally new to our channel in the way that we look at the night sky, we use 13 sign astrology, which uses the true position of the planetary bodies. So you might have heard that Pluto is in Aquarius, but this is truly not the case. Pluto moved into Capricorn about a year or so ago, and the last time this happened was in 1776. If I've triggered your curiosity, there's many videos on our YouTube channel where we have discussed this significant movement of Pluto going into Capricorn. So you can find all our videos on YouTube. You can listen to us on loads of different podcast platforms. You can book a reading or get yourself a chat. And I am going to integrate the beautiful messages you shared with us today, David. Any parting message from you?
No parting message.
Thank you so much. Ngā mihi.
Namaste.
Until next time.